On October 19, former President George W. Bush traveled to New York City to deliver a speech at an event dedicated to the spirit of liberty, at home, in the world. His message was sobering. Most of the media focused on Bush's implicit rebukes of the man who currently occupies his old office, Donald J. Trump, his barely veiled critiques of conspiracy theories and outright fabrication of bullying and prejudice in our public life, of a discourse degraded by casual cruelty. "We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism," Bush lamented. "Bigotry seems emboldened. The signs are insistent. The odious memes. The Heil Trump salutes. The racist graffiti. A rally to save a Confederate statue and unite the right that descended into violence, including the death of a young woman counter-protester. Recently I was kind of introduced to the concept of activism and rallies," says Gunter Rice, a 22-year-old New Jersey native who attended that deadly event in Charlottesville but was not implicated in the attack on the woman. "I'm like, wait, there's a bunch of white nationalists that go out in public and speak and do all this cool stuff and cool events? Hell yeah." The statistics tell a similar story. The most recent were released by the FBI just this week, the agency's annual measure of the number of hate crimes reported in the United States the previous year. The FBI defines a hate crime as a traditional offense like murder, arson, or vandalism with an added element of bias. In 2016 there were 6,100 reported instances of people targeted based on their race, religion, sexuality, disability, or national origin, an increase of 300 over 2015, and like last year the overwhelming majority of those victims were targeted because of their race or religion. Of the 4,496 targeted because of their race, 50.2% were Black or African American. Of the 1,583 targeted because of their religion, 55% were Jewish and 25% were Muslim. This is the second year in a row that hate crime numbers have increased, reversing the trend of the preceding 20 years. "I'm not surprised," said Dr. Jeff McDevitt, an associate dean and director of the Institute on Race and Justice at Northeastern University who has worked with the FBI to train agents to identify hate crimes. "The numbers are consistent with those reported in recent months by groups like the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center," he says, "as well as by cities and other municipalities. In fact, their numbers for 2017 are looking worse. In America's 6 largest cities, more than 525 hate crimes have been committed so far this year, up 22% from the same period in 2016. The reason I'm not surprised is this is just another indication of a coarsening of relations in America in the past year or two, particularly aimed at people of color and certain religious groups." Still, hearing a former leader of the free world concede that hate is having a moment? That's a turning point, an admission that's impossible to ignore. Hate in America began even before there was an America. Among Benjamin Franklin's many written rants against what he called the stupid, swarthy Germans, was this: why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens, who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs, any more than they can acquire our complexion. The new nation, he wrote, should be a haven for the purely white people in the world, because so many other places were black or tawny, Africa, chiefly tawny, Asia, or swarthy, most of Europe, including Spain, Italy, France, Russia, and to the puzzlement of historians for centuries, Sweden. It is only logical to distrust those who look different, he argued, because I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. As a consensus begins to emerge among experts that the friction we're now experiencing, from Charlottesville, Virginia, to Berkeley, California, may represent yet another one of those hateful peaks, it's worth considering what the present moment has in common with the past, and how it differs. The lesson learned from such a look is that while history and psychology act on our prejudices in predictable ways, hate manifests itself differently in every era. Today's haters, the white nationalist radicals of the so-called alt-right, are not nearly as powerful as Adolf Hitler's Nazis, or as pervasive as the small-town bigots of the Jim Crow South. But that doesn't mean they're harmless. Like all waves of hate, this newest one comes with distinct origins and unique challenges. Specifically, the rise of the alt-right has been enabled by changing norms and technology that make it easier to become radicalized in the first place. In fact, the rise of hate within America shares roots with the rise of hate toward America. The same tools and trends are helping to facilitate both terrorism and nativism. Hate, in short, is becoming more accessible than ever before, and that poses a distinctive, and particularly insidious, threat. Human beings have always harbored bias. The pathways to hate, experts tell us, are hardwired into our brains. But how does the psychology of prejudice actually work? It wasn't until the rise of the Nazis, however, that psychological inquiries into the nature of hate really took off. Theorists of the time came to regard prejudice as pathological, and they tried to link racism and anti-Semitism to specific personality syndromes. The most influential of these efforts, and the most widely criticized, was the authoritarian personality, 1950, a nearly 1,000-page tome authored by philosopher Theodor Adorno, a refugee from Nazi Germany, and a team of psychologists from the University of California, Berkeley. Employing what they called the F-scale, a novel way of measuring fascistic tendencies, Adorno and company claimed to have identified a new authoritarian personality type. Rigid thinkers who obeyed authority, saw the world as black and white, and enforced strict adherence to social rules and hierarchies. Authoritarians became authoritarians for reasons that Freud would recognize, according to the study, and they were more susceptible to bigotry, especially right-wing bigotry, as a result. The assumption that prejudice was a personality problem, however, soon fell out of fashion. In 1954, Harvard psychologist Gordon Allport published a landmark study, The Nature of Prejudice, that synthesized existing knowledge on the subject and came to a disturbing conclusion: prejudice isn't deviant at all, but rather all too human, the natural extension of normal psychological processes. The human mind must think with the aid of categories, Allport wrote. Once formed, categories are the basis for normal prejudgment. We cannot possibly avoid this process. Orderly living depends upon it. Since then, most research into prejudice has sought to measure and describe these processes. The prevalence and persistence of stereotyping, for instance, was established long ago. In 1933, Daniel Katz and Kenneth Brawley asked 100 Princeton University students to list traits of 10 racial and ethnic groups, then check the 5 they felt best characterized each group. Because the students agreed so often, 75% described Negroes as lazy, 79% described Jews as shrewd. Katz and Brawley were able to prove that these generalizations arose from widespread social attitudes rather than individual experience. Yet stereotypes are only half of the story. In the 1970s, researchers studying the dynamics of social groups found a pervasive in-group bias. Within minutes of being divided into minimally cohesive teams, even on such trivial pretexts as a taste in art, strangers tend to see their own group as superior and seek to maximize their advantage over other groups. Polish-born psychologist Henri Tafel explained this on the basis of what he called social identity theory. According to Tafel, groups offer people 2 key benefits: identity, they tell us who we are, and self-esteem, they make us feel good about ourselves. It's only natural, according to Tafel, that people believe their own group is better than other groups. This illusion can, in turn, deform our sense of why others do what they do. In 1979, social psychologist Thomas Pettigrew described what he called the ultimate attribution error, a double standard that explains negative outgroup behavior as dispositional, that's just what those people are like, while dismissing positive outgroup behavior as exceptional, a fluke, a stroke of luck, the product of lots of effort, etc. As blatant displays of bigotry declined in recent years, psychologists turned their attention to the prejudice that lurks below the surface, the so-called implicit bias that most people don't even realize they harbor. "I think implicit bias is a problem for everyone," Hillary Clinton declared during last year's first presidential debate. The most famous yardstick of implicit bias is the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, that was developed nearly 20 years ago by Mahzarin Banaji, current chair of Harvard University's Psychology Department, and Anthony Greenwald, a highly regarded social psychologist at the University of Washington. To date, the racial version of the test has been taken online more than 17 million times. It asks subjects to associate positive words with white faces and negative words with black faces, then do the opposite. The difference in reaction times is taken as evidence that making a positive association with members of a different race creates cognitive dissonance. But while the tendency to treat familiar faces with care and foreigners with caution may be etched into our DNA, it's certainly part of human culture. The mere fact that our circuitry and civilization are conducive to prejudice doesn't explain why some people act on their biases, and others don't even realize they're biased to begin with. So how does bias become bigotry? And why is white nationalism on the rise now? Self-described white nationalists claim to promote white identity and push for the creation of a separate but equal white ethno-state. Critics say white nationalism is merely a sanitized public version of white supremacism, which holds that whites are a superior race. Newspulse News uses the two terms interchangeably throughout this story. The first began during Reconstruction, when the Ku Klux Klan emerged in the defeated South, its malice aimed at freed slaves who were exercising newly granted rights. Next, the early 1920s, when Klan activity increased again, now directed at recent immigrants, particularly Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe. Those years marked the first era that immigration quotas were established in the U.S. Then came the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when the two steps forward in voting rights and housing and school desegregation sparked the one bloody and chilling step backward of racial reaction, lynchings in the South and race riots in the North. The Heil Trump salutes at a gathering of white nationalists shortly before the inauguration. An uptick in reported hate crimes across the country. The killing of Lieutenant Richard Collins by a white supremacist in Maryland. The double homicide and severe wounding of Good Samaritans defending teen girls in Portland, Oregon from another white supremacist. The nooses found at and near the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Any analysis of American hate, therefore, requires parsing what these eras do and do not have in common. Economic uncertainty also plays a major role here. John Hyam, in his seminal analysis of American nativism, Strangers in the Land, found a correlation between downturns in economic opportunity and the emergence of hate. During Reconstruction, more prosperous Southern whites lost wealth with the emancipation of the slaves, and working-class whites lost jobs to a newly freed workforce. Later, during the Depression, white workers blamed their struggles on Mexican immigrants, although the newcomers were, statistically speaking, even worse off. A second and related factor these eras share was the feeling that a group that was accustomed to being in charge was looking over their shoulder at a group threatening to overtake them. It's a strand of people acting as if they are independent when others don't think they should be, says Nell Irvin Painter, emeritus professor of history at Princeton University, where she taught African American history and a former president of both the Organization of American Historians and the Southern Historical Association. The last factor that all these eras had in common was political and cultural leadership that condoned the expression hateful views. After World War I, that was provided by President Woodrow Wilson, who had worked to resegregate employees of the federal government and who held a screening of the blatantly racist film The Birth of a Nation in the White House. During the Civil Rights era it was personified by such politicians as Lester Maddox, Strom Thurmond, and George Wallace. And what role do these factors play in the current outbreak of white nationalism? There is ample evidence that all three are at work, historians say. First, there is a feeling of deep economic instability.